Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second in the AVERT TSAS webinar series on religion and far right. My name is Michelle Grossman. I am the convener of the AVERT Research Network, and it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you here today on behalf not only of AVERT, but also of TSAS to today's presentation. This is the second in the series. In the first of these presentations on religion and far right, we had a really stimulating and provocative and enriching overview on the way in which far right extremism has mobilized various elements of right-wing of religiosity and religious discourse. And we also had a focus in the first series on some of the newer intersections and trends that have been emerging in relation to how religion and religiosity are being mobilized in various kinds of socio-political contexts. Today, we're going to be moving into looking more at some of the cultural discourses and dimensions of religion and religiosity in far right contexts. Really exciting program. So I hope you'll find it as stimulating and provocative as I'm sure I will. The AVERT TSAS relationship, has been going for a while, and I should say that the AVERT Research Network was inspired in terms of its creation and development by the wonderful focus and success of TSAS over in Canada. So it's an absolute delight for us to be able to sort of give life and form to that collaboration through this series. Just a few housekeeping rules before I hand over to Professor Lauren Dawson, the director of TSAS, who is going to be moderating today's session. So the housekeeping rules are really simple. We will have our 3 presentations. Questions will be held until the end, but you are welcome to post your questions in the Q&A function that you'll see at the bottom of your screen as people are speaking, and we will organize and moderate those questions at the end. Please don't use the chat function for questions and stick to the Q&A button. So Lauren, I'm going to hand over to you now.
Thanks very much, Michelle. Welcome, everybody. Really pleased to have you here. As we have people joining us from, hopefully, more or less all over the world, then it's good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, depending on where you are. It's evening here, as you can tell. My office looks like a bit of a cave, and I always have trouble with the lighting. I look like I'm preparing for Halloween here or something but I can't get rid of it, so you'll have to live with those shadows in this case. Really pleased that we're able to have this second webinar. The first one was very stimulating and very intriguing. As Michelle mentioned, the second one has a little bit more of a cultural focus. We have 3 great speakers. I'll introduce them a little more before each of them speaks, but we have Joshua Roos, Helen Young, and Austin Lawrence. This webinar is going to move a little bit beyond Christianity in some regards, so that we're going to be taking more consideration of other kinds of religious voices and influences on the far right extremism in North America, Europe, Australia, and elsewhere. Now, in case anyone still has any doubts that far right extremism is something we should be focusing on, I mean, I was just reading a New York Times article today that was citing statistics that we've seen before, but mentioning in the United States, attacks from the far right have quadrupled since 2016, and that in fact, in 2020, 90% of the attacks, violent extremists or terrorist attacks in the United States were associated with the far right. So it is a new ominous reality that we're all trying to cope with. I'm going to say just a few introductory comments here. They're not particularly related to the talks today. They're more just generally about how we should be trying to approach this topic. One of the great ironies of dealing with religion and extremism in any form is that, in fact, there's a tremendous amount of skepticism about whether discussions of religion are even relevant. I mean, to those of us who spend our lives studying religion, this seems rather staggering, yet we encounter it quite regularly in the academic literature and in the policy literature. Simplifying matters, roughly there are 2 sort of foundations for this skepticism. One is the sort of classic religion is good, Religion can't really be associated with violence, that if violence grows out of a religious orientation, then it's evidence that that religious orientation is distorted or corrupted and not truly religious. The second orientation, which I think is more troubling, is that a lot of social scientific literature dismisses the relevance of religion because they downplay the role of ideology. In general, they don't think ideology has a significant role to play in the process of radicalization. That means religion does not have a significant role to play. Now, I'm not going to dwell on these here, other than to say that I don't think either of these assumptions stands up to much critical scrutiny, either in terms of historical analysis, logical analysis, or empirical data and information. But that's a topic for another day. Now, in approaching this topic, I myself kind of favor taking a very broad approach, right, that recognizes that religion isn't the be-all, end-all. It's part of a massive, complex, interactive process of radicalization. But I think along with people like Eric Kurlansky and his colleagues, we can, reasonably say that basically there's sort of three components, and religion plays a role in all three of those components in different ways. One is that there's some kind of need. They call this the 3N theory. So there's needs that are driving social psychological processes that are driving radicalization. The radicalization gains focus or content or orientation, becomes oriented to action through interaction with that narrative. And then, of course, that narrative will only really become effective in terms of bringing about social action, social change, when there's a network involved, the social network that mobilizes the individuals in line with the needs and the narrative. So I think it's reasonable, and we'll probably see elements of it today, how we can see that cultural components of religiosity play a role across those three elements. Now, final comment I'll just say is that really, as some of you know in my writings, I've suggested that the issue really isn't religion. The issue is religiosity. In other words, it's the lived religion. It's the degree to which people have a personal commitment to a religious orientation or religious principles. And this means it's a perceptual thing. It's their perceived role of religion in their lives and in their actions in engaging in extremism. We need, if we're going to advance in understanding this phenomenon, to get at the actor's definition of the situation, as sociologists say, right? We need to humanize the actors by, to some extent, as best as we can under these very challenging situations, imaginatively understand their worldview and where they're coming from. And I think many of the discussions we're going to have today will help us in that process. Religion plays an important role, finally, as both a source point, a motivation for the kind of actions that are concerning and worrying to us, but also as a mediating agency. And these are both important roles that we have to understand, how it drives and motivates and how it shapes, forms, and influences the targeting, the actions, the behaviors of individuals. So I'm really looking forward to all of our talks tonight and to gain some insight in all of these regards. That's all I have to say by way of introductory comments. So our first presenter is Joshua Roos. Josh is a political sociologist and senior research fellow in politics and religion at Deakin University. His research focuses on the intersection of politics, law, and religion. And he's currently the chief investigator on an Australian Research Council funded study, The Far Right, Intellectuals, Masculinity, and Citizenship. Josh, turn it over to you.
Thanks so much for that intro and for contextualizing everything. I'm just going to go to share screen. Okay. I'll get stuck straight in to the timing. All right. So the aim of this paper is to explore, on the one hand, the deep historic and institutional roots of contemporary populist and far-right discourses in textualist Christianity, but also to look at key intersections in the present. I draw here on research conducted across a number of international contexts, including the US, the UK, Europe, and Australia. And I challenge the notion that religion has been hijacked by populists and examine the active role of fundamentalist or textualist Christianity in far-right authoritarian populist movements attacking the rule of law, women's rights, and minority groups across Europe, the US, and Australia. This is a broader international problem. I'm looking here in particular at Christianity and textualist Christianity. Women's bodies and women's rights in particular, alongside LGBTIQ rights, are particularly key targets for textualist Christians and the far right. And I'm going to delve into that in the back end of this presentation. The paper does have limitations. It's a large topic, certainly more than 20 minutes available, and I don't have time to delve adequately into race, Christianity in the far right, or new developments, though I do look at some of these at a superficial level. A quick note, there is some confronting imagery throughout, so please be aware of that. And a short note on language use. Look, I was born into an evangelical Christian household. I'm very, I suppose, intuitively aware of what's going on in terms of the languaging and so on. I consciously seek to extract Christianity from the privileged position that it occupies, not only in our institutions as a form of civil religion, but our language. There's some irony that after 20 years of the war on terror, we're now applying some of the same concepts to our study of radical Christianity. So one of the dominant tropes about the relationship of religion and populism is that religion has been hijacked by populists. Marzuki and MacDonald, for example, argue that we are faced with an increasing exploitation of religion in political discourse by both mainstream politicians and right-wing populists to express belonging rather than believing, to defend the territory of Christendom rather than the values of Christianity. It asserts that church elites typically condemn the instrumentalisation of religion for these purposes. And I argue here that while some groups do embrace an empty and rhetorical form of Christian identity, organised religion is an important ingredient of the contemporary right-wing populist and far-right surge. Attempts to exonerate organised religion and religious leadership from responsibility of the demonisation of other faiths show a startling lack of understanding about the theological framing of truth amongst fundamentalist textualist elements of organised religion and how it shapes highly energised, often hostile responses to other faiths and minorities that have everything to do with religion. Furthermore, far from being passive actors, organised mainstream religion, be it through denominational leaders, factional figureheads, or publicly aligned politicians, is actively competing for political status and power, pursuing religious exemptions from secular laws and taking sides with the establishment, if it's the mainstream religion, say, for example, the Church of England, or the new demagogues in their efforts to achieve survivability or, contrastingly, growth. Internal theological and political cleavages within religions and denominations often involve significant animosity, although those on each side seek the same reward, legitimacy, and opportunity to lead the institution in the direction they wish it to go. And this is particularly the case where authority is not devolved, as in the Catholic Church. So a little bit on truth. The possession of a unique claim to truth, that is, an understanding and unique relationship with God or a supreme deity, is an essential component of most, if not all, religion. Indeed, the most significant and indeed proudest claim of any theological proposition is to be true. For some deeply pious faith holders, the claim to truth leads to a journey of discovery and attempts to reconcile this faith with other traditions through interfaith work or ecumenicalism. For others, however, the claim to unique possession of truth defines the boundary of religious community. Those who use truth claims to demarcate community are identified throughout this book as, throughout this presentation as textualists or fundamentalists. So I frame here Catholic fundamentalists, for example, as Catholicists, in the same way that scholarship has framed textualist Muslims as Islamists. Let me go on to the next page. I want to delve into some of the historical dimensions of these truth claims and look at how relevant they are to today and these historical links. So Martin Luther was a German professor of moral theology, lived 1483 to 1546. He sought to challenge the perceived deviation of the Catholic Church from the fundamental tenets of Christianity as he saw them, for example, its sale of indulgences, to reduce the need for purification from sin in purgatory before believers entered heaven. In contrast to the Catholic reliance on scripture and tradition, Luther asserted the centrality of text, arguing that the Bible is the only source of revelation and faith in God alone is the path to salvation. He was excommunicated from the Catholic Church, though his theology and actions resulted in divisions that shaped Christianity to the present. Contemporary political commentators have made comparisons between Luther's hostility to the Catholic Church as an institution ruling over Europe, his use of vitriolic slurs and crude language, and his use of the printing press to spread his message, with contemporary British hostility to the European Union and the use of social media to spread contemporary populist messages. So similar resonance may be found in the tactics employed by former President Donald Trump. He expressed on a textual basis, grounded in his claim to possession of truth, a profound hatred of Muslims, Catholics, and Jews. You can see here some of the samples of the critique, but also hatred that he sort of demonstrates to other faiths based on his understanding of text and truth. In reference to the latter, on the Jews and their lies, he gave sincere advice in one of his TSASs in the form of a 7-point plan for the Jews' treatment, including setting fire to synagogues and schools, razing and destroying their houses, taking their prayer books and Talmudic writing, forbidding rabbis from teaching on the pain of loss of limb or death, removing safe conduct on the highways, stripping them of their wealth and forcing them to manual labour. It's not difficult, despite the 4-century gap in time, to see stark similarities between his particular work and the program of persecution carried out by National Socialist Germany, albeit under the rubric of race rather than religion. Thomas Aquinas, a fundamental saint within the Catholic tradition, addressed the growth of Islam and critiqued the claims to divine truth of the Prophet Muhammad. Aquinas argued that no wise men, trained in things divine and human, believed in him from the beginning. You can see the quote here, and I've just highlighted in bold, again, his fundamental claim to truth or mistruth. And he argues that Islam is false because proofs Muhammad used as proofs of the truth of his doctrine, only that could be grasped by natural ability with a very modest wisdom, basically accusing Muslims of not being particularly intelligent and doctrines to be false. Lest this be considered, a relic of, 500 to 600 years ago, we see Pope Benedict in 2006, give his Regensburg address. And he addressed the matter of the relationship between religion and violence. So this was a particularly important address because it was 5 years and a day after the 9/11 event attacks. So Joseph Ratzinger was became Pope at 78, and he took the pontifical name of Benedict, the Blessed, in particular after St. Benedict of Nursia, founder of the Benedictine order monasteries, and highly influential in the spread of Christianity across Europe. Benedict was defined in the eyes of many Catholics and non-Catholics alike by this address, and it was ostensibly a masterclass on faith and reason, but quickly turned to a dialogue between the erudite Byzantine Emperor Manuel Palaeologus and an educated Persian on the subject of Christianity and Islam and the truth of both, that is believed to have occurred during the siege of Constantinople between 1394 and 1402. His speech undermined the idea that Islam was rational and hence compatible with modernity. And he continued contrasting what he argued was a Christian tradition of non-violence grounded in Greek philosophy and rationality with a transcendent and irrational Muslim God. This led to a global controversy and condemnation from Muslim leaders worldwide, but received to some extent a level of support from Western European leaders in particular. There was a series of responses to that. I don't have time today to go into it, but it's important to use to note that to view this language as accidental would be to dramatically underestimate the intellectual capacity and orientation of Pope Benedict, who very much viewed Europe as Christian and sought to position himself as a defender of Europe's Christian identity. So populist and authoritarian actors are now mobilising religion as part of projects of national renewal on a global scale. You just see some pictures, Putin in the Orthodox Church, the Law and Justice Party and the Catholic Church in Poland, evangelicals and Trump. We could argue Scott Morrison and evangelicals are playing a greater role in Australia. Obviously Erdogan in Turkey in the bottom right-hand corner. So textualist religious actors are particularly keen to court political power. There's been a decline of their base, their demographic base and their base of support over the years due to a number of reasons. And they're seeking here to shape institutions and lawmaking in particular, and to resist secular laws, including anti-discrimination legislation and women's rights. And we've seen attacks on those across these countries. So we're talking here Catholicists, Protestant evangelicals, the Orthodox Church, but also in the developing world, in India, in Myanmar and Sri Lanka, and Turkey, amongst others. We'll quickly look here at this, the Catholicists, textualist Catholics, and their battle with progressives to shape the church. The election of Pope Francis was really a ground change, really saw a sea change, I suppose, in the way that that the church was being run. Pope Francis took the name of Francis of Assisi, who was known for his work for the poor, and took a progressive and inclusive approach to the church, moving away from that hardline conservative theology. He admitted remarried Catholics to communion and committed earnestly to interfaith dialogue. Just a week after becoming Pope, he talked about or called for more dialogue, particularly with Islam, and expressed support for migration, arguing the need for Europe to rediscover its capacity to integrate. Amongst many sweeping reforms and realignments, Pope Francis replaced Cardinal Muller, a committed anti-Islamic theologian and the Vatican's doctrinal head, and a Spanish Jesuit, and removed Archconservative Raymond Burke as a Vatican Supreme Court Justice. Given the significant theological and political shifts that have occurred since he took on the role, it's no surprise that he's made powerful enemies within. In 2017, for example, 62 critics of Pope Francis within the church signed a filial correction concerning Pope Francis's exhortation on remarriage and communion. Many of his critics appear to come from the United States. Following the 2017 correction, critics led by Cardinal Burke and Steve Bannon, former Trump advisor, and he's up to his eyeballs effectively in populist fermentation around the world, accused Pope Francis of public actions that indicated a rejection of the truths of the faith and the canonical delict of heresy. In other words, the more liberal theological orientation of Pope Francis stood in contrast to their hardline fundamentalist approach, prompting critics to commence political activism outside the institutions of Vatican power. So here, it's critical here that the first and most powerful weapon in their arsenal was to attack the Pope for denying divinely revealed truth. Cardinal Burke had extensive links with the Dignitas Humanae Institute, a right-wing aligned Catholic institute formed by British conservative Benjamin Harnwell, as a direct response to the growing secularist intolerance of Christians of all confessions that has led to a myriad of attacks on human dignity. I'm not going to go too much into evangelicals here because there's been some really brilliant work done on the relationship between evangelicals and Trump in particular. But it's important to note in the polling, for example, that 75% of white evangelicals voted for Trump in 2020, down from 81%, but still 3 out of 4. And that compared to 57% voting for Trump amongst white Catholics. So his base of support is very much amongst evangelical white Christians in particular. Liberty University President Jerry Falwell Jr. claimed, in my opinion, Donald Trump was a life of loving and helping others, as Jesus taught in the Great Commandment. And Trump plays this up. Now, we know that Trump is never particularly religious. We know that he's known for mocking his religious supporters at times. But he talks about going to church. My parents taught me the importance of faith and prayer from a young age. He held up the Bible in front of that church, obviously problematically, but plays it up, participates in prayer circles and prayer breakfasts and so on, and is forgiven for his indiscretions at the very least, and forgiven for that because he's seen as a president that's delivering on their legislative and legal agenda. reshaping the courts in particular with hundreds of appointments, and the US Supreme Court with the ultimate end aim and end state of, amongst other things, overturning Roe v. Wade, which grants abortion rights to women. This has obviously a significant impact because the US is still the world's power. It has a significant cultural impact globally through social media and politics. This is probably the crux of the conversation here and why we're, I suppose, doing this, this presentation. The far right, it's a contested term. It's obviously got its ambiguities. But what we're talking about when we talk about the far right are activists who seek to shape the world in their image. They are effectively textualists looking at, or fundamentalists who believe that the world needs to be remade. They have a number of fundamental intersections with radical Christianity, as I call it. The claim to a possession of a universal truth, a sense of having been marginalised, and a powerful sense of victimhood. And that's evident amongst both the church, who believe that secularism has undermined their power, and the far right, who believe that the liberal elite have, effectively crushed them. Nostalgia for an imagined lost past. So there's an aggressive anti-secularism, reassertion of Christian values are a common feature of far-right discourse online. Iconography. If you get online, you can see the way that there's been a merging of alt-right and far-right memes, for example, with Christianity. Anti-women attitudes are pretty central here. The right to choose is attacked by both the far right and the churches, the radical textualists within those churches. Anti-feminism, anti-rights, anti-women's rights, and a portrayal of women's sexuality as abhorrent and deserving of condemnation, both in the far right and amongst textualist Christians. And anti-women attitudes in many ways are a gateway to the far right. And so there's a sort of spectrum or linkage there. Hatred of LGBTIQ communities is a central feature, as is hatred of Islam. I don't use the word Islamophobia in my own writing, and it's not because it's not a useful word, but that phobia implies fear and implies an unknowing, not being known, that if you just came to know Islam, then you would come to accept it and be tolerant. There's a hatred. These are people who understand, who have read the Quran, who know Muslim communities and know their politics, who are actually quite well versed and have a hatred of Islam. Anti-Semitism, there's a complexity here in relation to Israel because there is anti-Semitism across both radical Christian and far-right groups, but they both in many ways support the notion of the ethno-nationalist state, which Israel isn't quite, but they view it in that way. They're both anti-science, they have a hatred of the political left, and the belief in a global conspiracy of the liberal elite to effectively undermine and crush and to enforce diversity and to undermine their values. They see that as inherently threatening to who they are and their way of life. Okay, I believe I've got 2 minutes. I'm just going to check chat. Yeah, I've got 2 minutes. So I'm just going to quickly cover over some sample quotes from far-right terrorists. Brenton Tarrant, prior to his attack in Christchurch, visited many Christian Muslim battlegrounds. He cited in his manifesto, Pope Urban II, exhorting Christians to join the Crusades, and he threatened Turkish people in particular in historic terms. Anders Breivik was a self-proclaimed member of the Knights Templar and used the imagery to the right here in his manifesto. And he stated that he must ensure that he prayed to God. God must ensure that warriors fighting for the preservation of European Christendom prevail. So you can see a direct intersection in the framing. Okay, last slide. So I think there's just future trajectories we need to be aware of, including the US far right and Christian right globally. They're impacting Australia. They're impacting people in their homes here in Australia and globally, in Canada, across the Western world and the English-speaking world in particular. On the right-hand side, you see a crusader and a Muslim warrior effectively saying together to fight, you know, the perceived immorality of the West and what it's become, including the anti-Semitic trope, Black Lives Matter, feminists, gangs, and so on. Everyone's lumped together. So there's been recently a US far-right admiration for the Taliban as undertaking a strong Christian presence in conspiracy movements, including anti-vax groups like the White Rose Society. Roe v. Wade is a key battleground. Texas abortion bans may well shape law, not only across the US, but globally across common law countries. Anti-women agenda and LGBTIQ of both the far right and textualist Christians is critical here. They are the front line of these attacks from both fundamentalist Christians and the far right. And freedom of religion legislation is increasingly being used as a gateway for discrimination, you know, the use of as a sword rather than a shield. And that's something that we're going to see more of over time as well. That's my book. A lot of this is covered in that. I'll leave it with the next presenter. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, Josh. So the next presenter is Helen Young. And Josh, you need to take your video off so that we can.
All right, one sec. Is
Just
that
a
off?
few words here with.
Yeah.
Here we go. Thank you, Josh. So Dr. Helen Young has a PhD in medieval studies and is a lecturer in the School of Communication and Creative Arts at Deakin University, and has research interests in the histories of race, racism, medievalism, and popular culture. There are longer biographies available for all of these speakers, but I wanted to give us more time to just deal with the talks. I think it's really interesting that Helen is joining us, really pleased, because of course we're stretching out the disciplinary range of the people that are engaged in this discussion. This is really important. Thank you, Helen. You go ahead.
Thanks. So you should now be able to see my slides, I think. Okay, so I do want to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the unceded country of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to any First Nations people here. So I thought I would talk briefly about what I mean by medievalism to start with, because this helps explain the specific religious medievalisms of the far right. So medievalism is anything that turns to the Middle Ages for its subject matter or inspiration, and in doing so, by comparison or contrast, comments on the contemporary milieu. Once you start noticing it, thinking about it as a category, you'll see it all over the place in 21st century Western culture. So gambling ads, sports teams names, Game of Thrones, political discourse, and so on. And its use has risen really substantially, particularly in political discourse, and particularly on the right since 9/11. Medievalisms may take some specific historical event, fact, or object as their reference point, or be unmoored and rather invoke a general, sometimes vague quality of medievalness. So they may have little or nothing to do with historical reality. What is thought to have happened matters a great deal more than what actually did. And there's often an inverse relationship between claims to authenticity and actual levels of accuracy. So by religious medievalisms, I mean anything that takes a medieval religion, religious practice, or event instigated by religious belief as its inspiration or reference point. This includes contemporary religious practices, but isn't limited to them. So from Crusader crosses and the Deus Vult battle cry to the Templars, mysteries of the Grail, and Norse runes and mythology, references to medieval European religions litter the far right landscape. And you saw some of these quite clearly in Josh's presentation, obviously. Much, although not all of this, is inspired by the Nazi obsession with the European Middle Ages, but it has also expanded and takes on new forms and is not limited to individuals and groups with specifically neo-Nazi ideologies. Contemporary scholarship on far right medievalisms, and there's sort of growing body of this work, was largely catalysed by the Templar fantasies of Anders Breivik. So Christianity, usually of the crusading variety and sometimes linked to the Templars then, and Germanic and Celtic heathenism, positioned as Aryan religions, are my focus today. To make sense of why medieval-ish iterations of and references to these two religions appeal to the far right, we need to understand what the connotations of the Middle Ages are in contemporary culture. So the European Middle Ages, as they're commonly thought of in the modern era, appeal to Nazis and to the contemporary white far right for four core reasons. So they're understood as a whites only space and time of racial, cultural and social purity, as part of the heritage of Western nations, as having had a rigid social structure. So usually we're talking feudalism here, but there are variations, and as being sort of inherently and fundamentally violent. These ideas about the medieval past structure what Andrew Elliott terms banal medievalism, which is endemic in Western societies and therefore largely unnoticed. It's linked to identity and heritage in indeterminate ways and serves to mask deeply ideological moves behind its quotidian ordinariness. Medieval religious violence against both Islamic and Jewish peoples is frequently cited as an exemplary and sort of ideal in far right circles. Josh mentioned Martin Luther and some of his expressions of hatred. They're not new at all in Luther's time. They're certainly very strongly kind of throughout the medieval period. The rigid social structure of the Middle Ages is really taken to mean heteropatriarchy, so lack of rights for women, violence against any LGBTQ people, and this sort of thing. So these beliefs about the Middle Ages are being challenged in both scholarship and mainstream representations, but they're very deeply entrenched in Western thought and culture. So the European Middle Ages are quite literally a white racist far right fantasy. These common beliefs are grounded in European ethno-nationalist, colonial and imperial ideologies and programs really emerging from the late 18th and 19th centuries. They developed not just alongside, but as a result of Enlightenment pseudoscientific concepts of race as biological. So this kind of centuries-long embedding of particular ideas about the Middle Ages can make it very difficult to disentangle far right from other medievalisms. And this is one of the reasons I think that they're quite sort of useful and significant for the far right. So there are, I would say, two broad types of far right religious medievalism. So one, and this is the first one I'm going to talk about, is the use of medieval or medievalist symbols or other sort of passing references with religious connotations. So you might see here the black sun symbol or the St. Maurice eagle on shields at the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally in 2017. So the St. Maurice eagle was probably a mistake because St. Maurice was black, but anyway. So I would include in this the kind of ritualistic acts that are devoid of religious context and committed by people who otherwise do not practice a related religion. So we might think here about members of the white vigilante group Sons of Odin swearing allegiance to him, or Brenton Tarrant's passing mentions of Valhalla in his manifesto. So the other kind other sort of broad type is practicing a religion that specifically invokes medieval beliefs and practices. So I'm going to talk a little bit later about Wotanism, a form of heathenism espoused by David and Katja Lane. I won't talk about this quite as much now that I've seen the topic of Austin's, as I'd planned. Now I've seen the topic of Austin's paper. And there is, I would also acknowledge, some very real ambiguity and crossover between these two broad types. And I think that's exploited quite consciously by the far right. So the tattoos of Jake Chancey, the so-called Q shaman who was part of the Capitol riots in this image, are a salient example of the way that religious symbols that may relate to a deeply held belief and active religious practice can also be signs that communicate a particular ideological affiliation to others. So the ADL cautions that the Thor's hammer symbol, which is the one you can see here on his torso, is a hate symbol, but it's also used by people who are not part of the far right. So medievalist iconography of this kind effectively hides in plain sight It serves as a sign to those who are in the know, but also lends plausible deniabilities in ways that a symbol like the swastika doesn't. Amid the banal medievalisms of everyday life, they are still signifying, or they signify heritage that's marked as white and are a potential point of connection via common interest and attachment to potentially sympathetic whites who are not yet sort of part of the far right. As Dorothy Kim admonished medieval studies academics in 2017, they also signal unwelcome and lack of safety to people of colour, queer people, and other marginalised groups targeted by white extremists. In an absence of any other framing, such symbols must be understood by those who are unsafe around extremists as at least signalling a white space. So I think the function of these sorts of symbols and other shallow references is principally semiotic and social rather than religious. And this sort of thing isn't limited to Norse symbols and references, so Templar and crusading imagery. So things like this Trump meme that circulated in 2018 is also very common. It's often a sign of a specifically anti-Islamic position, so clash of civilizations, great replacement discourse, that sort of thing. The Trumps leaned very heavily into crusader symbols. And I think there is some ambiguity, a consciously exploited ambiguity here, and Josh sort of alluded to this too, between defending the territory of Christendom and defending Christian religion. The most well-known example of such references are, of course, the Templar fantasies of Anders Breivik and Brenton Tarrant, both of whom really position themselves as waging new crusades. In Tarrant's manifesto, they sit fairly unusually alongside Norse-inspired heathen images and references, including the final line, "See you in Valhalla." So some of the symbols that Tarrant and others use, so such as the black sun symbol from the title page of his manifesto, so this is a different image of the same symbol, are modern creations. So the black sun is a variant of the Sonnenrad or sun wheel, so an ancient European symbol used in both Norse and Celtic cultures. This particular version originated in Nazi Germany as part of Himmler's renovation and redesign of Wewelsburg Castle as a centre for the SS. So it's a project that was deeply steeped in the occult and heathen medievalism. The Nazis were also, in other ways, very into Christian medievalism. Since the end of World War II, it has been used as an alternative to the swastika by neo-Nazis. This process of recreation of an historical symbol to a new political and ideological context is typical of a much broader cultural process of medievalism. But we also have signs like the Othel rune, which is part of the Futhark or runic alphabet that was historically used in medieval Northwest Europe. So like the black sun symbol, it was associated with German Nazism and has been taken up by contemporary white supremacist groups, including in the USA. As Adam Miyashiro writes, it has become symbolically connected to the blood and soil movement. So both historical and medievalist heathen symbols are also associated with white nationalist groups, particularly in the USA and Canada, where they invoke very short-lived medieval Norse settlements in claims of sovereignty. So Jack Donovan and the Wolves of Vinland group are an example of this. Donovan's Ways of Men is medievalist in its construction of white masculinity, which is quite anti-woman. The Wolves of Vinland, he was a member of that group, invoked the figure of the Viking warrior as what has been termed a racial patriarch. So there's substantial crossover in this kind of group and through its medievalist positioning and use of symbols with men's rights activism. Religious references also can facilitate transnational connections. So the Sons of Odin, the vigilante group I mentioned earlier, started in Finland and has had chapters in most Western nations. I think they're defunct now here in Melbourne, but I'm not totally sure. They have a strong anti-Islamic stance. So there's no simple or completely consistent mapping of one religion to one ideological focus across the far right. So I do want to talk relatively briefly about medievalist religion. rather than symbols and references. And I'm just taking this one example of an explicitly white supremacist version of heathenism. So you can see some of the symbols I've been talking about on the cover of this book. This is a version from the late 90s, but a 2012 re-edition, which is substantially bigger, is marketed on Amazon as a primer book in the Euro-tribal ancestral spiritual path of Votanism. And it's also listed, when you have a look at a reasonable number of kind of general heathen websites that have, you know, lists of, well, you could read this book or that book, and this one's interesting. This one pops up there, and McVan's other books come up quite frequently. So Matthias Gardel has a chapter on Votanism in his 2003, The Gods of the Blood, for a detailed account. So I'm not going to sort of go over everything there, and I really just want to focus on its medievalist aspects and how they work. So in its essence, this is a religious expression of David Lane's 14-word slogan: we must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. So Lane wrote a preface to Creeds of Iron that makes this clear, and he projects it back in time, his kind of ideas back in time, to reify and legitimize his own position. So this is just a little extract of what he says in his preface. So in the earlier sections of the book, Ron McVan, who wrote most of it, positions religion, specifically folk religion, as he claims Votanism to be, as essential to racial survival. So he says it's giving purpose, meaning, unity, and collective consciousness to the civilization. So in addition to the various uses of not very accurate at all Viking and Norse imagery, he, like Lane, medievalizes the white nationalist political project that they're undertaking. So with comments like this. Medievalist references are woven throughout the book. So for example, he gives the entire Futhark spiritual symbolism that aligns with his ideology. And this is what he says about the Othel rune. Religious practices, paraphernalia, and signs are described very often with explicitly Norse or other medievalist references, although these are not exclusive. So he references, you know, he claims Egypt was Aryan. He claims basically every kind of key beat in Western civilization, he claims, was a white Aryan civilization, and that there was a form of Votanism in it. So we've got here instructions for signing the hammer, and this refers to the Thor's hammer symbol that we saw in the Q shaman's tattoos. So Votanism, like other far-right heathenisms, including that of the Wolves of Vinland and the Asatru folk assembly, invokes the Viking warrior as an archetypal racial patriarch. Vikings are constructed as natural, free from the comforts and degeneracy of civilization, and the authentic state, and as being the authentic state of white European masculinity. So it's very much about sort of nostalgia, recuperating the past, these kinds of things. So coming back to these core beliefs about the Middle Ages, I want to, sorry, there they are. I want to draw some of these threads together. So the rigid social structure of feudalism in Christian Europe has long been a focus of fascist desire, while the heathen far right, including Votanism, positions natural law as supposedly ruled in Norse parts of Europe in similar ways. So there's this real idea that society was a particular way and there was no movement and that was the right way for it to be, is very strong and very appealing to kind of an authoritarian mindset. Against the backdrop of banal medievalism, with its simultaneous invocations of white purity, heritage, and violence, particularly male violence, religious references connect different white extremist groups to each other, working across their specific ideologies and identity formations by invoking a common idea of a nostalgically longed for pure white past. The mixture of symbols in the Christchurch Terrorist Manifesto is a good example of this at work, an observation I owe to Dorothy Kim. The use of religious references and symbols from Christian and heathen tradition invited groups that use those references themselves to identify with the terrorist and his acts. So legitimization of violence and as a political tool and as a natural necessary act in defense, often of whiteness, but of various other formations, is key to far-right medievalisms, whether it's the Viking warrior or the crusading knight is invoked as the archetype. So the links to violence are just really omnipresent in the medievalisms of the far right. So religious medievalisms connect violent far-right groups and individuals not just in the present, but across time, using religious symbols and references and framing religious practices as medievalist, positions acts of violence in a mythological context of millennia-long struggles for racial and religious survival and supremacy. So Bennett, Furlow and Goodall shows that this positioning is common to both Islamic and white extremist narratives that invoke the Crusades to give mythical significance to contemporary violence, for example. So really everything from terroristic acts of mass murder to putting up stickers and racist baiting of co-workers can then be understood as an heroic act in defense of an imagined white race that spans the past, present and future. Thanks.
Thank you, Helen. I've found that actually quite fascinating. I'm not very knowledgeable of many of those things. And I think there's a lot to really think through there and a tremendous amount to build on in the future. Of course, it's intriguing, right? We're all through popular culture, everything from Game of Thrones to you name whatever, are totally steeped in this kind of fantasizing that has linkages to the medievalist and the far right agenda. So this is, I'd say very fruitful, and I think everyone can understand and resonate with this, even if they've never read any of this actual far right literature. Austin, are you ready at your end? We'll get going with you. Okay, so Austin Lawrence is a doctoral candidate in the Criminology and Social Justice program at Ontario Tech University here in Canada. Austin is a Canadian federal government criminologist that is currently on education leave from the Canada Centre for Community Engagement and the Prevention of Violence. Austin, it's over to you.
Great, thank you. All right, I'm just got my screen up here. All right, great. So this presentation I'm making is doesn't necessarily have, it's not really an organized narrative. I'm going to be presenting more detail rather than introduction. So from Helen Young, we got a great introduction to the some of the ideas and concepts of racist heathenry. However, a lot of research has been done on racist heathens, but not a lot on non-racist heathens, and there are lots of those as well. And part of what I want to do is compare the two beliefs. Also, I want to talk a little bit about that creep. We've heard some presentations in these different presentations that when there is a terrorism, then we can identify different types of religiosity. And we can see Christian religiosity and heathen religiosity within the same person. And to me, if someone uses a black sun symbol, that is a religious practice. If they're using a religious symbol and displaying it, even if they don't follow that religion, they are displaying religiosity of that religion, which is interesting. We have to sometimes, I think, start to distinguish between praxis and doxa. But anyways, here's my presentation. Racist heathens, we mentioned that when I'm using the word heathen, by the way, I'm using heathen as an emic term. I myself follow this religion, the inclusive form. And so and racists also too, they often call themselves heathen, which is the umbrella term, like pagan, neo-pagan. So Germanic neo-pagans, we call ourselves heathens quite often. So the first expression of heathen religion in the modern era was, as Helen mentioned, it came from the Germanic faith movement and became part of Nazi ideology and was part of that milieu. So that started with Armamism and the Volkish occultism. It wasn't quite a new heathen religion because they weren't willing to give up Christianity or Christian mysticism, but it was a fusion. Then if for Australians, this may be interesting, your own Alexander Rudd Mills, he invented Anglicanism, and essentially was an Anglo-Saxon supremacist form of the religion. It kept the idea that you could have an actual practiced heathen religion alive during the Second World War period and afterwards. And so we have this sort of progress from folkish, which is of course German faith movement, to the idea of folkishness, which is has been mentioned already, which is essentially racism. Now, inclusive heathenry, so non-racist heathenry, that started to emerge in the late 70s and the 1980s. So racist heathens were here first. You'll hear non-racist heathens saying the racist heathens are appropriating our symbols because they identify with the symbols, but of course the symbols were being used long before. There's a number of different historiographic tropes. Helen Young has mentioned a few of the racist ones, but there are also non-racist ones. And I've found that they roughly follow historiography, European historiography of the period, as interpreted by the modern media. So we have the idea of the trope of the Viking, the emotionally doomed warrior. So if someone has a lack of marriage prospects, resources, respect, whatever, you take them by force. They're really against elites and they feel like they're outsiders, means justify the ends, and they're really into individuality, right? Then we have the yeoman trope, which is the frithful freeborn farmers. This is where people are imagining themselves as being, as reproducing the idealized tribal values and culture that existed, that they imagined to have existed in Europe before the kleptocratic colonizing Christianity, that they view Christianity in a very negative light. So they go to the pagan past instead. However, they are into laws, just pagan laws, pre-Christian laws. They don't like the idea of the outlaw, which is like a Viking. They really often focus on communities and society with this type of trope. Another trope, which is common to third positionists quite often, is the idea of nobility, aethelings, blue-blooded power. This is historiographic tropes where we look at conquest and control by elites. So for instance, the Gothic tribes as an example, as they went through Europe. They really think about, they really identify with might makes right. They have the concept of a tribe as a homogeneous and unified folk. And this is really gets into the blood and soil idea. The trope again of the trader, which is it's all about intercultural collaboration. So peace is profitable for everybody. It's much more multiculturalist. A tribe is whoever works together. People who believe in this type of heathenry often, focus on confederations. They tend to be much more syncretic and allow people who practice different forms of ethnic religion in their groups. And they are much more flexible by and large. So I've positioned these like rough tropes into the two-axis political map, which is of course, it's a reification, but it'll help you sort of think about these things. So we have the yeomen who are more authoritarian and cooperative in their economic views, and the aethelings who are the nobles who are more into competitive economics and not exactly for democracy and individual rights, and traders and Vikings the same. So that was just expanding a little bit on what Helen was talking about. Now I'm going to talk about some incidents of white nationalist terrorists and identify examples of heathen religiosity or heathen social meanings that they have used to express and describe their motivation for the attack, right? And then we come, of course, to the Till Valhalla phenomena, which I'll get to a little bit later. So Dr. Young mentioned David Eden Lane. What's important about David Eden Lane is that his attack that put him to jail was done with a group of individuals. This is essentially chapter 2 of the Turner Diaries. You may be familiar with chapter 3, which was the Oklahoma City bombing, but this happened before that. It was one of the first modern right-wing extremist terrorist attacks that used the concepts from Louis Beam's leaderless resistance and put it into practice, right? About half of the members of the order were Odinists, so modern racist heathens. And David Eden Lane transformed that Odinism and with Ron McMahon and Kat Lane into Wotanism, which Helen mentioned. The other half of the individuals in this terrorist group were identity Christians. In Canada, you may have heard when Canadian peacekeepers went to Somalia, our elite unit, the Canadian Airborne, had a number of members who kidnapped and tortured and murdered a Somali teenager. Members of this unit previously had been parts of neo-Nazi skinhead gangs. And afterwards, the members of this unit went on to become members of Blood and Soil, which is Canada's first listed right-wing extremist terrorist entity. And again, one of the things I noticed was I met a member of the Airborne at a bus stop, and I noticed I didn't know he was a member of the Airborne. I saw he had a Thor's hammer tattoo on his neck. So I started to talk to him about heathenry. I was going to invite him to something. But then I realized quite quickly that it meant, the hammer meant white to him. It didn't mean heathen religion. Another terrorist attack was one in 2009 in the United States. It was the shooting of the Holocaust Memorial Museum done by James Bernacker von Brunn. And he had put out a biography that he put out himself. And he identified Odinism as his religion in that biography. We have then Anders Behring Breivik. It's interesting that we're still using his old name. He is legally, I believe he's legally changed his name to Fjotolf Hansen. And one of the indicators here is Fjotolf is a kenning for the Fenris wolf, which is one of the mythological figures in Norse mythology, which brings about Ragnarok. And so one of the things about Anders Breivik is he really leaned into this to the Crusade motifs and imaginings. However, he also used Old Norse mythology and religiosity as parts of the way he constructed his self-identity and the way that he projected his political project, right? And in prison, it seems as if his heathen identity has deepened. We also have another example would be Lindsay Suvarnarath with the Halifax Mall plot. Now, this plot was foiled. However, her example of heathen religiosity, she is more or less, she started off in atrocity fandom. So fandom of mass killing shootings. So she's really, she really leans into the nihilistic side of the identification with the sublime of evil and of death. And the symbols that she uses to express those fantasies were those of neo-Nazi symbols and quite often heathen symbols as well. So she participates in heathenry indirectly through a fetishization of the Nazi era as a place of darkness that will give her power if she can join that type of violence. So again, heathenry, but with an overlap to other types of ways of thinking and believing, which may lead us to think, oh, is this heathenry or mental illness or something else, right? When we get to mental illness, we get to Jeremy Joseph Christian, and his name is actually Christian, right? But he, in his diatribe when he attacked two women on two Muslim women on a SkyTrain in Portland, he would later kill one of the he would end up killing someone who was trying to defend her with a knife. And you'll see on the back of his neck, he has a skull and a Viking and sort of a Conan version Viking tattoo. He also used a lot of terminology that was heathen terminology, but he used generalized terminology from a lot of that used a lot of right-wing tropes. But he really leaned into some of the heathen ones. Then we get Brenton Tarrant. So, and this is where I'm sort of bringing up the idea of the Till Valhalla phenomenon. After Brenton Tarrant had his attack, and I downloaded and read his manifesto before it was taken offline. And I contacted someone, a former extremist heathen that I knew in Florida, and I was talking to him about Till Valhalla, the idea of Till Valhalla. And Till Valhalla now has been taken on by, it's used as a battle cry by the Norwegian military. Till Valhalla is now also a project to unify veterans in the United States. And so it has gone much beyond its original heathen meaning, but it still maintains it in many respects. And you'll see Tarrant too using the Othala symbol, the Othala rune, and other types of heathen imagery as well. So who's to say how, it's hard to say how much is him using the symbols to sort of market his cause, and how much is him internalizing the social meanings of these symbols and feeling a numinous quality associated with them, which would of course be religiosity. Oops, wrong direction. We have another example in Canada. This is someone who didn't actually attack anybody, but had been arrested for hate crime offenses. He's an example of another person who his name to express changes the heathen identity. And here it's Loki Huldegard. Loki is a Old Norse trickster god, and Huldegard means the hidden home or the hidden place. So of course, you know, he's probably the bearer of secret knowledge that no one else has. We have another example here. Some of you may know the Dark Foreigner. Currently, to the best of my knowledge, identity hasn't been uncovered, although they do live, according to anti-racist activists in Ottawa, where I do. And they use, their art uses the iconography of the Armanen period. I mentioned that at the very start of the presentation, that the Armanen style heathenry, that was started around 1908. It continued onwards and influenced Nazis. Later on, it became sort of transformed with Satri Devi and Miguel Sugerno into esoteric Hitlerism. And he really follows and uses the heathen symbols that conform to the esoteric and Armanen Hitlerist use of heathen symbolism. All right, so can I just get a quick check to see how much time I have? I forgot to check the time.
I think you have about 5 minutes, Austin.
Thank you very much. So, so here this is gonna be really fast. I can share my slides afterwards, but one thing I'm interested in is overlapping identities. So, and what also too are the differences? Are there any differences in practice or belief between racist heathens and non-racist heathens? And are there tells, etc.? No one's really done this kind of comparison. Here in the next couple slides, I'm just going to quickly go over my observations from being in this environment and studying this environment for quite a while. So racist heathens, generally speaking, they use religion to support race, to maintain their whiteness privileges, basically doubling down on whiteness. They express this ideology in a number of beliefs, such as humans are equal to gods, they should never lower yourself in worship. They're really focused on honor. Whereas inclusive heathens, the non-racists, we use religion to try to escape race and biological ethnicity so that we can construct our whiteness as something that can fit into an equitable multicultural society. And of course, inclusive heathens don't talk about whiteness because we're trying to escape it, right? And to inclusive heathens, quite often gods are more than humans. There isn't this focus on lowering yourself in worship, and there's more focus on values of peace and relationships. Racist heathens, they tend to be more henotheistic, so they focus on one god. You know, Odinism, the one god, it's a polytheistic religion, but they're talking about only one god, right? Racist heathens tend to believe their gods are omnipotent and can read their minds. Inclusive heathens tend to focus on more diverse divinities and spirits. They're also less focused on the omnipotent qualities of their gods, and they sometimes worship across pantheons or religions. Racist heathens tend to sort of focus on soft polytheism. They often use Jungian archetypes and the Jungian ideology, sort of theory in their religious theology. And they resist personal revelation. However, at least in North America, inclusive heathens tend towards hard polytheism, individualized divine personalities. That's how they view the gods. And they include more personal revelation. To racist heathens, ancestor equals bloods equals Europeans equals white race. And ancestors are basically heroes that are treated as collective martyrs. Inclusive heathens are a bit different. To them, ancestors could be of blood, but they could also be of place or of spirit. And ancestors are what make up a unique me, right? Heroes are treated more as personal inspirations than as martyrs. And imagined ancestors of inclusive heathens often include people of other religions and ethnicities. The idea of folk is a bit different too. So racist heathens, of course, ancestor equals folk, equals white race, and the identity politics of us, the red pilled. For inclusive heathens, folk can either mean co-religionists, so the religious experience of us, or it could be fellow citizens in your nation, depending on how they construct their religion. Heathenry focuses on virtue ethics, not lists of things you shouldn't do, things that you should do. So the racist heathens usually follow the 9 noble virtues, what they call the 9 or the NNV. And you'll notice that they highlight individual interior virtues. However, inclusive heathens have expanded this list quite often, and they acknowledge missing virtues like peace, justice, guestliness, citizenship, hall joy, more group values and virtues. Racist heathens tend to view their mythology as a chaos versus order story, an us versus them of the gods versus the giants, so the good gods and the evil giants. To them, Odin can do no wrong, and Loki is an evil foreigner and queer degenerate. However, the interpretations of inclusive heathens are quite different. To them, the myths are generally speaking stories of contrasting and conflicting loyalties that have to be resolved between different tribes. So, and in inclusive heathens often recognize Odin as both good and bad, not just good. And Loki is often interpreted as a heroic minority migrant and a trickster. Runic mysticism is shared by both groups. However, racist heathens tend towards using different alphabet systems. So Futhark basically means alphabet, and there's different alphabets from different historic periods, and also different invented Futharks that are full out aren't historic at all. And the racists like the Armanan Futhark the most. However, they also do use the Elder Futhark. And inclusive heathens, we use the younger Futhark, but we also use the Elder Futhark. Racist heathens tend not to like to do Sed, which is spirit sorcery. And so if it doesn't have a rune, it's not magic to a lot of them. But however, inclusive heathens are into reconstructing and reproducing spirit sorcery as well as runic mysticism. And in terms of eschatology, at the end of the Old Norse mythic cycle, there's a period called Ragnarok, which is the apocalypse. Essentially, it's, racist heathens often interpret that as a race war, and that post-Ragnarok will be a racial utopia. Many of them are looking forward to Ragnarok, but sort of something that's a bit conflicting is that they also sometimes see it metaphorically, so it can happen more than once. And they see Ragnarok as maintaining Odin's creation, the struggle to maintain Odin's creation. However, inclusive heathens see Ragnarok more so probably as a resource war than a race war. They also think that post-Ragnarok will not be a better time. It's just going to be a different time when we're picking up the pieces. Many of us aren't looking forward to Ragnarok. And some inclusive heathens also think it's metaphorical, so it always warns and never arrives. And inclusive heathens generally interpret Ragnarok as a punishment for Odin's crimes. So I think I've gotten through the main differences. I don't have anything to wrap this up. I thought perhaps some of the details that I have outlined here may stimulate thought with regard to perhaps some of the other speakers as well. So, just the meme here, I write heathen memes, inclusive heathen memes on Facebook. I've written about 2,000 of them so far. It's something I've been doing as I'm reading for my PhD. So this one here is Andrew Jackson, of course, Trump's favorite. He's the architect. Oh no, this is Jefferson. Yeah, with a helmet on. So this is expressing sort of the Jacksonian heathenry that a lot of the racist heathens express. And so I have a few. That's what that one's from. Anyways, that I am done, And thank you very much for listening, and I hope to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, everybody. Just, okay, wait for, so we've got a few questions here that have come in from individuals. I also would welcome our three panelists. If you have questions you'd like to ask of each other or further comments you'd like to make based on what the other panelists have said, please chime in as well. I'll just start with one question that is just one of the first questions to come in is just, to what extent is the radical Christianity defined more by its hatreds than its beliefs? I mean, to what extent, I guess this implicit behind this question is, to what extent are we dealing with a movement that is, in a sense, and it gets into this question about whether it's religious or not, I guess, right? Is it really more some kind of reactionary movement galvanized by shared hatreds rather than a really sort of belief-based religious system? And could this explain why they are so readily able to support Trump when it seems obvious to most of the rest of us that Trump is less than a virtuous Christian? Josh, this is to some extent directed at you, but if anyone, any three of you feel free to respond to this.
Yeah, thank you. To some extent, for me, it's about borders around the religion in many respects. I mean, Catholicism's got close to 2,000 years of theology. Pope Benedict wrote encyclicals about hope, about charity, things that in many respects no one could really critique or condemn. But they're within that boundary of being extended to Catholics. And to some extent, it's about, well, you're either in and you're part about us, or you're not. So to me, I think this issue of whether or not these are religious groups or whether they stand only against something, and they've got a deep-seated history and thousands of years of intellectual development and internal arguments and so on. What we're seeing, though, is this evolution, in particular over the last decade or two. I think that in many respects has been defined by social media, has been defined by a response on the one hand to this perceived threat of Islam and Islamic and Muslim demographic growth, but on the other, really this populist epoch and moment that we're in, where religion has been on the decline. Organised religion has been declining in terms of numbers and so on for probably the best part of 40 or 50 years. And so it's an opportunity to regain impact and to regain a real leverage in society through aligning with these actors. So I don't think they stand only against. I think there is a deep-seated intellectual tradition to both evangelical movements and the Christian right, but also Catholicists. There's a deep-seated history, but it's becoming more and more at the public and political level about what they stand against, and they've lost what they stand for, I would argue.
Any comments from the other panelists? Oh, okay, move on to, so there's just a quick question here for Austin or Helen. Someone asked, I'm not aware of what they're referring to, perhaps you will, said, do you think that the Othel rune-shaped stage at the CPAC in February was a coincidence or a deliberate reference to racist heathenism?
Yeah, so it was one of the big conservative political congresses in the US. I saw this, I thought about it at the time. I mean, I'm fairly uncomfortable about ascribing intent to somebody who, who designed the stage. I don't know. But it is, I would say it is quite a stretch to think of this as a coincidence. And certainly its function, whether or not it was designed that way, it was certainly taken as a deliberate signal of we are your people kind of stuff. Austin, I don't know if you have any.
Well, yeah, I'm the same, because we don't know enough information about the staffers or whoever made the design decisions, and etc. However, the proportions of the stage and even the colors that were used were reminiscent of the modern National Socialist use of the Odal rune. And one of the things, I believe the stage 2, it was a winged Athala, I believe, which was the winged Athala was the original racist version, because that's the one in the Arman and Futhark. That's also the one that was used by an SS division to represent its unit. And so that's the one racist heathens usually use. They've dropped off the little wings to seem more inclusive, right? To seem more like regular heathens. And I noticed that in heathen social media, everybody accepted that. I'd say 90% of the people assumed that they'd done it on purpose, because it was our symbol. It's like if a a Muslim group accidentally made a stage with a cross on it or something, right? The Christians would say, of course, the cross is put there for a specific reason, and all the heathens did the same thing, even if it was an accident.
Well, there's a nice follow-up question here. Hopefully I'll be able to make the link. I think the question's meant to really be a bit of a challenge to the whole presentation, but I think it's a good one we can tackle, and that is, the question is, this imagined past or mythology is so ridiculous and so obviously made up, it's merely a way of signaling community, or is it? It's being asked as a question, which raises the question, what are the ties that bind this rather loose community? And they talk about whiteness, violence, land, anti-feminism, gayism, etc. Now, I think this goes to the heart of the questions we're raising here, right? And it goes into maybe a bit of a tension between Austin and Helen, not in a serious way, but, use of symbols and religiosity. And is use of symbols automatically or inherently an element of religiosity? What is the fit here between a playfulness, a fantasy component, and a component of true religiosity? And I think underlying this is the notion that a real threat should come from true religiosity and not just from fantasy play. And maybe that's, I think that's a serious misnomer. So you can see there's a lot of angles to go at here. Any of the three of you, would you like to chime in on that question? Yeah,
look, I want to start by challenging the premise of the question. When you say it's, the imagined past mythology is obviously made up. Part of what I was trying to get at is that it's not. I mean, it is made up, but that's not obvious because of the really deep entrenchment of particular ideas about, my period is the European Middle Ages, but about that period. So most people, even, honestly, even within medieval studies, we've got direct, we're one step away from Milo Yiannopoulos. He writes about medieval studies. So there's a real belief in what is kind of being positioned here as a fantasy. So while there is no historical connection, or it's extremely twisted in a lot of cases when you start to dig through it, that's not widely recognized. And so you cannot discount and say, oh, well, they're just fantasizing. It's just, surface stuff. It's cynical, whatever, that sort of thing. You cannot discount the depth of belief that people have, and not just far-right extremists. I fell into this through racism in fantasy fandom, kind of via Tolkien, and people saying, well, you can't have a Black person in a movie about the Middle Ages because that's inaccurate. And this kind of thing elicits death threats. So there's really a real problem with trying to draw that distinction, because it discounts the significance of how people who use these symbols may feel and what it may lead them to do, as opposed to the kind of, I had Peppy the Frog in the Crusader outfit, probably cynical, that one, but also, reaching out to people who do not see these things as fantasy or playful or anything like that. I had a guy leave me a 4.5-hour voicemail message a couple of weeks ago over my reading of Tolkien as racist. So, they do not see these things as fantasy.
Austin, you had something to say too.
Yeah, I just want to say that the entire past is imagined, right? We have historic facts, and then we reimagine the past, right? We reattribute social meanings to things that have happened. And Christians do, religions that have a text do the same thing with a text. You read the text and you imagine yourself in the text. You engage with whatever your religious history is or your tradition through imagination. And I was an atheist before I was a heathen. I wanted to enchant my worldview, and I decided to choose a religion, right, to practice, because I wanted to engage in deep play, right? So Clifford Geertz has this idea of deep play, right? It's normal stuff that represents something about the world, your ontological position and place in the world, and your practices relate to that. It doesn't matter if it's invented. Like, I was an atheist, and I thought all religions were equally silly. Just because it's been there for 2,000 years doesn't make Christianity any less silly than a reconstruction of heathenry. You're still talking to invisible beings, et cetera, et cetera. The only thing that makes it less silly is that you have thousands and millions of people believing with you, right? Like it's minority status that makes it seem silly, not the content of the belief. So I just want to point that out, right?
Yeah, that's something, of course, I used to teach ad nauseum in 20 years worth of doing new religious movements courses, right? I would constantly utilize contrast between mainstream religiosity and, let's say, the Church of Scientology. And you're able to quickly establish with people that the beliefs of the Scientologists are not necessarily all that more unusual than most other religious beliefs. And that as a result, we have to bracket what we think is plausible and not plausible relative to our context, et cetera. I think there is a really important deeper issue here, which I was glad for all these presentations. And I was alluding to it in my introductory comments, because we're dealing with what sociologists call lived religion, lived religiosity, which is a very messy affair. It's highly personalized in a modern context too. It always is, but in a modern context, even more so. It's a bricolage, right? It definitely involves fantasy. And all of those elements are present in Western jihadists too. And they've come out in statements made by Western jihadists. When they make those statements, it's usually used as an excuse for dismissing the significance of their religiosity, where I would invert that and say, no, the very fact that they've engaged in a kind of fantasy role play about jihadism, and they've done it in an unorthodox and historically inaccurate way, actually goes more to the heart of recognizing the way in which they had become personally very engaged in this salvific, myth and quest. So it's, this is all debatable, right? And it has to be debated in some detail. So let's see if I go to other question here. Now, another question is this, that of course, it's again, I think trying to balance out, the question is, all the panelists dealing with the theme of have been dealing with the theme of religio-cultural insiderism. This has been common across the presentations, and it intersects with in-group, out-group dynamics for extremist groups and ideologies. To what extent do you think this represents the use of religio-cultural insiderism as a gateway recruitment tool for right-wing extremist movements?
I think I understand the question. I think any group does that. I don't think it's specific to religion, because once you get into a small group of individuals where identity, your internalized sense of identity gets identified with the lived people in your social network, you look at another person, you say, that person has the same identity as me. I know that person and I have an emotional connection to them. Once you get into any situation like that, I think it's attractive, because that's what's attractive. And then together you can live outside of regular time, because you live in a mythic narrative. And one of the things about that is religiosity, because that sets you in a mythic time frame. It makes whatever you do heroic, and it puts you outside of time and place, right? And when you experience yourself outside of time and place, that's a religious experience. And so to me, that can sometimes take place in non non-religious groups. So groups that are perhaps use religious discourse, like environmental terrorists, for instance, or environmental extremists, right? They will use religious narratives and neo-pagan religious descriptions, but they're not actually neo-pagan religious, right? So they're not undertaking those practices, but they are still nonetheless living a mythic, some sort of mythic ideal with one another.
Any other comments from other panelists? No? Okay, well, we are running towards the end of time. I'm going to interject one final question. So you've all been steeped in studying these really fascinating subcultures, right? And especially the symbolism that is being fashioned and created and discovered and used for a wide variety of purposes in these movements. What comes across today for sure is the tremendous diversity of perspectives, and that there's overlap between the Christian and the heathen perspective, between the medieval and a contemporary context, etc. It's quite a mishmash for someone to come to from the outside. Do you think, this is a bit of an unfair question, but do you think in terms of people being concerned about the threat posed by the far right, present and in near future, that this very mishmash, this great pluralism within tradition of the far right and its use of religious symbols is a strength or a weakness, in the sense of, do you think it makes the far right a more lethal concern or a more lethal threat, or a less lethal threat? Many of you all know what I'm talking about, because the internal division of the right has always been used as the argument for saying it'll never really amount to the same kind of threat as Islam. Maybe not, though, from the kind of things we've been talking about and this incredible cultural creativity. Josh, you look like you might be willing to say something to this.
Yeah, look, really, really important question. And I think, look, you do new religious movements work and research, and, you know, the way that they emerge and they bring different and disparate ideas together and then grow. And that's the basis of every major religion on earth. We're at a point now, I think, where there is such a accumulation, such a wide variety and fluidity to these movements. It's really hard to identify core consistencies. You're talking core themes at the moment, but I think it's dangerous. I think we're at a point where, combined with real political power and will to mobilise, we saw Trump and the will to mobilise certain groups. We've seen this across Europe, with populist parties and so on. I think we're at a particularly dangerous and pivotal moment. I think we've had numerous economic catastrophes, the global financial crisis, and now COVID. I think the way that these movements are coming together and sort of merging, there is the danger of them developing into mass movements over time. I don't think it's yet. I don't think the terror threat there, for example, is from certain groups. I think it's individuals at this point. But I do think that we're seeing an evolution. And social media is playing a big role in bringing people together to have these conversations who may never have otherwise met. So I think it's about the moment. And I think that to that extent, we're seeing, and we don't know where we're going to go, but we're seeing the emergence of new forms and new movements.
Yeah, I'm very worried about right-wing extremism in Canada. You know, I work for public safety. Talking to people at TSAS, etc. Like the threats are real. I've done some consulting with the government as well, as you know, on threats. The thing I'm worried about is not necessarily like a social revolution or, claiming large areas of land like Daesh and, something like that. What I'm worried about is a sustained and low grade mass shootings and mass killings. Essentially will be hate crime, uber hate crimes. Right. So what we're experiencing, right, rather than individuals or thrill-seeking teenagers, etc., you have to think, you're thinking about hate crime or hate crime typologies. These terrorists are mission offenders, right? But they're mission offenders who work in groups quite often, And even if they're lone wolves, they develop their identity and their sense of social status online within a community, right? Even if they act tactically alone. So yeah, and one of the reasons I'm worried particularly about heathens is because we organize ourselves, racist or non-racist, essentially in cells already, because our institutional structures, our theology, et cetera, doesn't match any of the government, the way that governments regulate religion, that people think about religion, et cetera. So we don't get called religion. So we have to create everything, all the infrastructure and so on ourselves. So we're very removed from the state, right? As a religion, the racist or the non-racists, right? And even more so, I think, than immigrants who are coming to this country, say. And so our religious identities are really, really not related to the state at the moment. But interestingly enough, both heathenries, sort of the racist and non-racist, the reason we picked pre-Christianity was because that was before the state was imposed on Europeans in the north, right? And so what we're often arguing about is what's wrong with the state, right? And so what cultural elements has the development of a state done to society, done to religiosity, done to the human's connection to meaning, right? And so to a racist heathen, what they're saying is like, the state has removed the freedom of white men to be white, right? And of course, we know the history of, I interpret the history of as the opposite, right? And so my reason for being interested in the state was because that was before authoritarianism and centralized rule came in, right? That's when there was tolerance of many gods, many ethnicities, because there was a tribal interaction. And so we have opposite ways of reconstructing and using the medieval past.
Very interesting points. Michelle, you look like you want to chime in for some final words.
Thank you very much, Lauren. First of all, I want to thank all three presenters as well as you, Lauren. The presentations and the discussion have been absolutely riveting, and I think have really, really deepened the insight and understanding that we need to have of what are really extraordinarily complex social and cultural phenomena. The one additional observation I would like to make as we close off this session, and it goes back to a question that was asked by one of our audience participants. Are we really seeing, a movement on the far right in relation to how they mobilize religiosity that's more about their hatreds than about their beliefs? Now, we argued something similar in a Horizon 2020 project that I'm involved in, the Greece project, where we said, look, really what characterizes the relationship between the far right and religiosity is what they're against. Anti-Muslim, anti-Semitic, anti-women. It's about what they're against more than about what they're for. But I think that these presentations, have started to shift my own thinking on this question. One of the most powerful things that we've seen recently in jihadist discourse has been thinking about Islamic State, for example, is the nation building project that they attempted to advance, aligned with being against a whole lot of other stuff in very destructive ways. And what these presentations have really, really brought out, I think, is the inextricable link between perception of cultural threat and the mobilization for cultural preservation, right? If we discount what they're for, cultural preservation, and only focus on sense of cultural threat, I think that we are then misreading the dynamics that we're seeing and consequently misreading the peril that they pose in terms of mobilization to violent action. So that would be my final observation there.
And I would just add to that, Michelle, a little note sort of building off of Joshua and otherwise is also involves a politicization, because I think under contemporary context, especially in light of what's happened in the States, but elsewhere, everything you said, I think I fully agree with. And then just add the element that it's becoming politicized. All these acts of cultural reappropriation are no longer secluded from the political realm. They're all understood by those participating in them as being inherently political acts. And they actually then are making the link to securing political power. And that maybe becomes the frightening aspect of this, additionally frightening aspect of it.
Yep, agree. Okay, I am aware that we've run a bit over
Yep.
time because we've had such rich and remarkably fascinating content. So thank you everybody for participating. Lauren, thank you for wonderful moderation, and of course to the presenters for really, really top shelf presentations. And we look forward to seeing you again. Thanks everybody, and goodbye.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank you
everyone.
for participating. Excellent presentations.
Thank you.